The past few years have just flown by, and it's crazy to think that now I've had the Red Komodo for over 2 years. Now, if you're watching this video, you've probably seen a lot of content on the Red Komodo and know enough about it spec-wise, but you may want to hear about the long-term ownership of the camera and was it worth the investment between buying the body and accessories needed to operate it. Especially if you're not in a huge production market like LA, Atlanta, Vancouver, Toronto, etc. Here is my story of why I bought the Red Komodo, why I really loved the camera, but after a little over a year and change, started to use it much less. Now, I still have the camera, and we'll talk about why, plus my experience transitioning from being primarily a Blackmagic and Lumix camera user over the past 5 years, moving to Red, and now primarily actually shooting with Canon mirrorless RF mount cameras. By the way, if you like this kind of content, please feel free to hit that subscribe button to see much more content like this from the channel. Right before I purchased the Red Komodo, I was filming primarily narrative and documentaries. We were using Red so much on set that with rumors of the Komodo coming out as a cheaper Red to own that was very similar in image quality wise to their more expensive cameras, I knew it would be a smart move to grab one as an owner-operator, even to use as a secondary camera a lot, pretty much have as an option for rental on any of my gigs. I was hooked on the idea. Then the pandemic hit. Now, me, like so many others, didn't really know what our futures would hold. As most of my work at the time was in Atlanta, I was planning to move there too. But when the pandemic hit, I stayed down here in South Florida. Then, during the pandemic, the Komodo was released, and I already knew a few gigs I could utilize it for that were still on the books, so I went and purchased the Stormtrooper model. 7 months after purchasing the Komodo, I went back and forth between Atlanta and South Florida, finished most of the projects I purchased the Komodo for, and I really enjoyed using it. The image quality for what I needed was fantastic. After getting used to the camera, it was pretty easy to operate, and the camera plus accessories were all paid off. First thing that happened after I decided to stay down here was I picked up a job working for Grant Cardone as part of his video team, and we actually utilized mostly Sony FX3s. I used the Komodo occasionally, but for the kinds of work we were doing, which was very run and gun, using the FX3s were actually much better suited, especially with the autofocus and internal image stabilization. That made me realize that at the time, owning multiple Blackmagic pocket cameras and the Komodo were kind of pointless for the work I was transitioning to, especially because with my workflow, all these cameras did very similar things, so I opted to just keep the Komodo of the cameras. Since I didn't need all the Blackmagic cameras, I sold them all, and then when I left Cardone, I knew I wanted to transition to having a video-based agency creating content for local businesses, help them create and generate income. And when I filmed these videos, especially by myself, I started to have a need for cameras that were like what I had with the FX3. But since I owned so many EF and RF lenses at this point, it really made no sense to go Sony and to pick up a Canon mirrorless camera. Now, here's where my choice to keep the Komodo came in. So since both 4K 24 and 4K 60 are downscaled from 5.2K on the Canon R6, and it was slightly better at low light, I decided to go for that over the R5. I could have purchased the R5 as well because of its 8K internal RAW video, but at that point, it was still overheating a lot in the 8K mode, so I'd really only be using its 10-bit video modes. Also, since I have the Komodo and the R3D codec is so much better than Canon's RAW, I just knew I would never utilize the 8K the way I would need to with the R5. And when the R7 came out, I now use both cameras as my two angles for most of my documentary style work, since it's easy to match both the R6 and the R7 using C-Log3. So at this point, why else keep the Komodo? The Komodo's 6K R3D RAW for the occasional gig that can utilize it is great to have. I don't use the camera for its global shutter that often. Again, it's great to have, especially for the occasional feature that needs it. The main thing for me is the price of the camera. It's worth holding on to, in my opinion, especially because the return you can get with owning it long term versus renting a Red every time you need it becomes a strong selling point towards Komodo. If it was much more expensive like the V-Raptor, then for my uses, it wouldn't have made as much sense. But for the price point that Komodo is at, even with all the accessories, for what this camera delivers, if you're going to use the Komodo to its strengths, then even 2 years later, it's still a very solid camera and I don't regret buying it one bit. When it comes to run and gun work, when I'm traveling light and the Komodo is packed away, it's still really small. My issue with the Komodo for run and gun work, besides the black balancing, was when I would bring V-mount or BP chargers in addition to all of my other devices that have USB-C power delivery, I would bring a bunch of chargers with me and it would just add to the bulk. However, I recently got this cheap little device that adds power delivery to any V-mount battery that offers D-tap input and output. With that, now I can carry one type of power accessory, even though yes, I'll have multiple chargers, multiple cords, at least it's one type. If I'm away on a shoot, getting a replacement power delivery charger or cord is much easier to get instantly than having to go order a V-mount charger or BP charger online. There's also the case that since all three of my cameras now have RF mounts, I can share every lens and adapter I own between all three cameras with various sensor sizes from Super 35 to full frame. So here's a great example of a situation that I can't really use the Komodo for, not that I bought it for vlogging specifically. That's one of the reasons that I moved to the R6, just because if I want to, I can quickly set this camera up, get going, and get really great quality footage. So when I got the Komodo, one of the first questions I asked myself was, am I going to use this for a lot of narrative work? And at the time, the answer was yes. And even now, I still am using it for narrative work, so that kind of ticks off that box. The Komodo really sings in narrative production, and that's one of the main reasons I purchased that camera. Also, owning the Komodo brought me on gigs with producers who are looking for owner-operators, especially owning RED cameras. I was also able to rent the Komodo to certain productions as well, so owning the camera definitely has some benefits in that department. That leads me into the next part, which is, are you working on productions that are primarily using RED cameras? If you are, then adding Komodo into that workflow makes a lot of sense. However, if you aren't, you're working with productions that are shooting mostly on Canon, Sony, ARRI, whatever, well then unless they have a specific reason to use Komodo, it may not be the best choice, but if they're shooting on all RED, it's an amazing choice. The next would be, do you need a camera that has a global shutter? Because Komodo is one of the few cinema cameras that has a global shutter, and if you're shooting really fast moving objects like cars, like my buddy Joe from Driven Films, or you're an FPV drone pilot and you want the best cinema quality camera you can have for the smallest size, then the global shutter makes a lot of sense in those situations. Me personally, I never really use the global shutter, but it is really nice to have. So as I said in the beginning of the video, I don't use the Komodo all the time, but I still tick off a lot of the check boxes of those questions, which makes the Komodo still worth having in my opinion, at least for my workflow. I may not use it quite as much, but it's always nice to have it there. Instead of having to go rent the Komodo, I can actually be the one charging that rental. Now, here's where it may be a little controversial. I think here in 2022, if I didn't already own the Komodo, because of the situation I'm in, I'd probably just buy a Blackmagic Pocket 6K, because for me, the Pocket 6K does a lot of what the Komodo does for me. However, it is limited in a few departments, but it's also almost a sixth of the price if you buy it used. But again, I already have the Komodo. It does have better image quality. It shoots in the R3D codec, which is better than B-RAW. It just has some more pluses to it. Along with all the other reasons I mentioned today, that's pretty much why I hold on to this camera. I still can make money off of it, even with not using it as much as I originally intended. So all that being said, even 2 years later, I love the Komodo and all that it provides. If you're in a similar situation as me, I hope hearing this may help you if you're looking to pick up a Komodo now, especially since they're a lot more widely available now than they were when they were released in 2020. If you have any questions on the Komodo, or if you have any ideas of content you'd like to see with this camera, I am starting to put it back in rotation, do more content with it, so please feel free to ask in the comments below. Let me know what your thoughts are, any ideas on videos may be. Also, if you got knowledge and value out of today's video, please make sure to hit that like, subscribe, and notification bell to keep up to date with the latest videos on the channel. Until next time, my name's Geoff Fagien. Thank you for watching, everybody, and I will see you in the next video.